what angers me the most, what frustrates me the most, what drives me crazy the most is this: Christianity made me talk like an idiot.
In December of 1968, 3 Apollo astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, made history by becoming the first human beings to orbit the moon. To commemorate their historical event, during a live televised broadcast on Christmas Eve, the 3 astronauts had decided beforehand to read from the opening verses of the book of Genesis.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
The 16th century astronomer Johannes Kepler, who discovered the laws of planetary motion, concluded that the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. The famed 17th century astronomer Galileo once said that mathematics is the language that God has written in the universe. Veteran Hubble Space Telescope astrophysicist Dr. Anton Kokomower, who has overseen the careful production of innumerable iconic images taken of the universe by Hubble, observes that just contemplating the sheer scale of the universe, as well as the beauty revealed in all our astronomical images, can leave anyone with a profound sense of awe and wonder, regardless of one's perspective on religion. From my own personal viewpoint as a Christian, I would say that we can appreciate even more deeply how the writers of Scripture were inspired thousands of years ago to write, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim his handiwork." Psalm 19:1. But do these statements make these men sound like idiots? Our guest for our November 2022 Atheist and Christian Book Club is Atheist podcast host and author Seth Andrews, who suggests that at least Christianity made him talk like an idiot, while careful to make clear he does not mean to say Christians are idiots, and that he admires and respects Christians. Christianity itself is idiocy, he claims. Here is Seth in 2017 giving the talk that inspired his book we will be talking about this month, Christianity Made Me Talk Like an Idiot.
Another group of apologists spends all of its time explaining how God is indeed proven. He's all around us. It's so obvious. How could you miss it? Like this guy, Dr. Stephen Meyer. He's a Christian who works for the Discovery Institute, which is a religious organization posing as a scientific one. He has no firsthand training or degree in molecular biology, so obviously he decided to write a book on the subject. It's called Signature in the Cell. It's been roundly tossed out.
Stephen C. Meyer holds a PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University. His book, Signature in the Cell, is published by HarperCollins and became one of the top 10 best-selling science books on Amazon in 2009, and it was named one of the top books of 2009 in the prestigious London Times Literary Supplement annual Books of the Year issue. Meyer, like Kepler, Galileo, and a host of other scientists, scholars, and Nobel laureates, is a Christian. So can something which has for millennia inspired countless billions of people, including some of the best minds in science, literature, art, and music, really be idiotic? Find out what Seth has to say as he joins us for our November 2022 meeting of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Here is the co-founder and host of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, Watchman Fellowship President James K. Walker.
Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of believers and skeptics respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. What we do is we usually alternate books. We'll do a Christian book one month and an atheist book the next month. I'm the co-founder of the book club. My name is James Walker, Christian apologist, president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical organization doing research and outreach in the area of new religious movements, the occult, cults, and controversial doctrines, practices, and spiritual leaders. The other co-founder who's also with us this evening is a former Christian himself, very well read, former believer, Bill Cluck, and I met him, I guess now about 6 years ago, and we began to go to the weekly meeting of Metroplex Atheists at the bar at Jay Gilligan's right down the street from my office. Got to know some of the atheists there. We talked about all kinds of things for about a year, and we talked a lot about books. And so when that kind of season came to a close, we thought, can we do something kind of like that where we were looking at books and having this discussion? And so 5 years ago, this is a little bit more than 5 years ago, as we started the book club. We were meeting in person and sharing a meal together at our office in downtown Arlington, but since COVID, we've been doing almost all by Zoom. I want to welcome everybody to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. And Bill, is there anything you wanted to say before we introduce our guest author?
No, it's just, when I was at Jay Gilligan's, someone said, "So you've never heard of the Thinking Atheist?" I went, "No, what's that?" And, it's just been a real delight to look at Seth's podcast. And, it's really great what he's doing for the movement, and to let people that in small town America know that, hey, you're not the only atheist in the world, in America.
Well, our guest author is Seth Andrews, and it was exactly, we were talking about this right before the club meeting began, but it was just about exactly 2 years ago that Seth joined us for the first time to talk about his earlier book, Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. And boy, we had a lively conversation about that. Christians, atheists, talking about this Fox News Christianity and what that's all about. And you said, "Well, James, why would you have him back after you went through that the ringer with him 2 years ago?" Well, as Christians, we have a martyr complex, and so we're looking for reasons to get beaten up, but just kidding about that. No, Seth was delightful and did a really good job of explaining his position, defending the book. He was wonderful to have as a guest, and so we are excited to have him back to talk about his more recent book. And so the book we're talking about today is Christianity Made Me Talk Like an Idiot. So Seth is a former Christian broadcaster, so he's not only a former believer, he was in the industry, so to speak. A former Christian broadcaster raised in Christian fundamentalism. Today, Seth is an advocate, not for religion, but he's an advocate for people. He's as a former Christian, now atheist. He ultimately encourages everyone to root their pursuit of truth and reason in truth and reason as well as evidence, and to pursue what he calls a personal relationship with reality. He is the host of two podcasts. On The Thinking Atheist, Seth Andrews explores his past as a former Christian broadcaster and a believer for 30 years. He provides reasons and evidences that helped him ultimately escape the bonds of the superstitious thinking to embrace the more satisfying, he says, explanations that are provided by science. A professional video producer and host of one of the most popular atheist communities on the internet, Seth Andrews is brings a polished format, a relaxed environment, and a Rage-free. Now, we like that here at the book club, Seth. Rage-free challenge to the religious beliefs that defined his youth. His new podcast is not really so much about religion or atheism. It's called True Stories, and it's inspired by the classic radio broadcast of Paul Harvey. How many of us are old enough to remember the rest of the story? True Stories episodes are short vignettes, usually maybe 5 minutes or so, featuring strange, compelling, and entertaining human stories from our past and present. Seth lives now in Tulsa, Oklahoma with his wife Natalie, his unofficial mascots Linus and Cat. He enjoys movies, sushi, tennis, casual gaming, 80s music, piano by ear, constantly flipping his pillow to the cool side. There's several of us that have that as a hobby. And
Gracie.
Yeah,
and,
well,
and
I
Gracie,
think that's an older bio because
the
I got
older
a Shih Tzu
bio.
now. We've got a new
A
addition.
bigger family.
So, yeah,
but
yeah.
his biggest delight is exploring the true meaning of life, which we all know to be 42.
That's true.
You want to be sure you visit Seth's personal page at SethAndrews.comn. Seth, welcome back to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Oh yeah, I've been preparing myself all day for the. I figured, you wanted another shot at me, so I signed up for more.
Yeah,
but it's an honor to be here. You're right. I mean, I think
just
spirited
look at
was a
Peanut.
good word
Just
for
look
the
at
last.
Peanut, she'll cheer you up.
Spirited was a good word, I think, for the exchange we had last time. But and I hope this comes up today. But more and more, I have been. In fact, I'm releasing the video and audio of the speech I been giving throughout the fall, called "You Are Evil and You Must Be Destroyed." And it talks about how we have hyper factionalized ourselves to the point where everybody's screaming and nobody's talking. And often we miss people who we may have a disagreement. Let's call it a theological disagreement. Let's say we disagree about the God question, et cetera. But more and more, what if we line up in terms of values? What if we love people? What if we want to be moral? And what if we want to tell the truth? And what if we want to see justice prevail and help the disadvantaged? And so I've become more and more interested in, do we share our values? And in that way, I stand as an atheist activist shoulder to shoulder with Christians against Christian nationalists and people like Bible scholar Dr. Kristen Dumais, who just wrote Jesus and John Wayne, and Rachel Lazar, who is a practicing Jew. She runs Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And some of my dearest friends are God believers, and it's because we really share values. So it's good to be back, and I appreciate the invite very much.
Well, it's great to have you back. And so I take it that you're no fan of cancel culture?
Well, I think it's messy. I think there are examples of cancel culture in the world where people just overreact. I call them offense archaeologists. They'll scroll through 10 years of tweets and find something horrible that somebody did in a different chapter of their lives. And without finding out if they have apologized or evolved or if it was taken out of context, they'll just go crazy. But I also believe in consequence culture. And I think it's just fine for somebody's feet to be held to the fire if they are genuinely awful, or they are spreading really bad ideas, or they've done something that's just markedly terrible. And we say, well, there will be a consequence for that. So, if you represent a corporation and you're a bad representative, and they say you don't line up with our values, they have every right to pull the plug. That's not cancel culture. I call that consequence culture. But I do think that we have seen kind of outrage for sport, outrage as oxygen, especially in the era of the internet. And I worry that we knee-jerk immediately to vilification. Well, there are true villains in the world, but I'll tell you, not everybody that we're throwing grenades at over the wall deserves it. And I think, we need to be creatures of consideration. And the atheist movement is not immune from it. I don't think this is a religious thing or an atheist thing or it's a human thing. Tribalism, tribal bonds, tribal othering, type 1 and type 2 errors, and we can get into that. This is, this is part of the human condition. And we see it throughout the primate world and in the animal kingdom. And we have to be aware of it and try to overcome it so that whenever we do go after hard targets, it's because it's necessary. and they really are hard targets and not somebody we just knee-jerked against in the Twitterverse.
Well, I'm going to, Seth, I'm going to get a question or two at the beginning and then turn it over to Bill. As co-founders, we're going to take that privilege and have first shot at you just to get the conversation started. But everyone else, if you have questions, and I know some of you know the drill and are already doing this, some of you, this is your first time to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. If you're new to the club, if you'll text your question or that you want to ask a question, then Daniel Ray is going to be the moderator. You can just put it in the general, or you can text him directly in the text feature here, and he will kind of cue you up and then let us know, and you'll get a chance at that point to unmute your microphone and talk to Seth, ask your question. I wanted to, first of all, there's an elephant in the room a little bit here, Seth, on this, on the title. So I'm conflicted on your whole title of your book. So I'm thinking, is this a stroke of marketing genius? Or is this the most egregious case of clickbaiting I've ever seen? And I kind of go back and forth between the two. And so Christianity made you talk like an idiot. And it's as I'm reading the book, it's almost immediately backpedaling. You don't mean, apparently, that Christians are idiots, or maybe you were meaning that you weren't an idiot. But I quickly said, no, you're saying that none of the Christians were idiots, but that they talk like idiots, and that you did too. So I'm not quite sure, even now, having read the book, and I also watched your 2017 Toronto talk, that was kind of the genesis of the book. Are you saying that Christians aren't idiots, or at least many of them are not idiots, but they simply talk like idiots? Or are you saying if it quacks like a duck and if it talks like a duck and walks like a duck, you got a duck? What exactly are you meaning by the title?
I'll take issue with any use of all or none when it comes to my addressing of Christians or any group. What's that saying? All generalities are false. So nowhere in the book do I say that all Christians, because you'll find idiots. You'll find really astute people, and you'll find thoughtful people, and you'll find idiots and toxic people. You find them anywhere you go. So there's no mention of all or none when it comes to the religious. But I'll tell you, being conditioned by family and culture, I, for lack of a better way of saying it, had been programmed to speak and act in ways that were nonsensical. If I was to look at it from a more distant vantage. Everything happens for a reason kind of thing. Or, Lord, we ask you guide the hands of the surgeon, which made no sense whatsoever. But, I wasn't a stupid person, but I had been indoctrinated or programmed and then reinforced by family and culture to say things that really made no sense. I will admit to wanting the title to get attention. And I addressed that, I think, even on the back cover of the book. Am I marketing a little bit? Well, I did want to get attention, but I will say beyond that the book is not an attack on Christians. It is an attack on what I consider to be bad ideas. I think it's conciliatory and even charitable to human beings who have a faith, not just Christianity, but all kinds of faiths out there. But it doesn't mean that religion doesn't often cause smart people to say and do things that sound incredibly stupid, and I stand by that.
So it sounds stupid, but they really aren't stupid. That's the part that are idiots, not stupid. You said idiots. So
well, whatever.
Yeah. So I don't quite understand. Are you trying to say if you really understood why they're saying what they're saying, it's not really idiotic, or it really is they're talking like idiots because really, if you understand why they're saying what they're saying, it's pretty idiotic.
My IQ did not change from when I was a believer to now. And I just think that's probably the case across the board, right? I'm talking about the power of indoctrination and a lack of consideration whenever people are speaking and acting using these religious platitudes as a backdrop or even a foreground. And somebody can feel personally attacked, but there may be those people who do that, and I realize the cost benefit when I titled the book that. But I think my larger point is that much of the language embedded in religious cultures, Christian culture, Islamic culture, Hindu culture, etc., superstitious, especially fundy, superstitious cultures, they are, the sort of these deities. They're designed to sound profound, but often they're thought stoppers. Often they make no logical sense. And it's fine to say that people who are sometimes smart people are often really good at outsmarting themselves. Yeah, there's a book out called Why Smart People Believe Dumb Things. And it talked about how often it's the really intelligent people who become the most adept at being able to sort of connect dots that normally wouldn't be connected. They're really, 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 really clever. Well, they're smart people, but it doesn't mean that the conclusion they came to was a smart conclusion. And I think that's a fair thing to say. It's not an attack on people.
Yeah, I think that probably is something most everybody here in the room on both sides of the fence would agree with, that you can be very intelligent on both sides of the conversation. The other thing is that kind of the 5 years of the book club has shown me that I kind of knew theoretically to be true, but experienced it, is how the same data can be interpreted wildly different ways depending on what your presuppositions and worldviews are. So the very thing, on any topic, not just God, whether medicine, vaccines, politics, on every one of these things, you look at evidence and you automatically, we have a bias where we're going to want to interpret that according to our worldview and cite the very same study or the very same data to try to make the case. So,
well, if I
smart
may,
people who do disagree. Yeah, go ahead.
If I may, I do think that being aware that we are biased creatures is very important. But I also think that scientific the results of experimentation, testing and retesting and looking at the results, this process is not something where the results will change based on equally meritorious bias, right? I mean, someone is going to be more wrong than someone else. And there may be a correct answer. You mentioned vaccines. I have a friend who says, well, I got the flu vaccine and 2 days later I got the flu. Therefore, the flu vaccine gave me the flu, right? Well, that's medically impossible. It is scientifically impossible. And this claim that the flu vaccine gives you the flu has been examined meticulously in a lab. Now, if you take the person who says, I know it because it happened to me, or if you take the people who actually know vaccine science and know what they've done with the influenza, and they know all the processes and how the virus is actually dead and how it causes things to replicate. And if you understand, there are people who are going to be more credible and who are actually going to be more evidence-based or results-based. They're going to be more objective, or at least relying on the data that's more objective than others. So I think we fall into a little bit of a trap when we say, well, if I look at the evidence for Noah's flood, and, there are going to be these people who think they've got this evidence and these people, they've got this evidence. Well, I think that some of that is a cop-out. I think, no, let's look at the evidence. And then not how do I feel about it, or am I listening to an apologist who is an apologist first, not a scientist? What's the geologic column say, right? What does the layering of sediment say? Where are the fossils at? Is there any evidence for a global flood? Logistically, does it make sense? Morally, does it make sense? You can dissect these things, and it's not going to be a bias thing. At the end, it will be, did it happen or did it not, based on the evidence? And you can come to conclusions, I think.
By the way, Seth.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill. I was going to ask you to
step on in there. Well, this segues into exactly what I was going to talk about. What kills me is when atheists have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to the Noah's flood narrative. It's a blended narrative from the P writer of the 6th century, the J writer of the 10th century. That's why you have 40 days and 150, and you can't understand this unless you know Hebrew. The other thing, I just totally agree with you, Seth, is smart people still cannot overcome bias. Give you an example. We had Sarah Saliander on. I told her nobody believes Moses wrote the Pentateuch. You can go to any university. She goes, I don't agree with that. So it doesn't matter if you have a PhD, you still can't escape your culture. We're swimming in a Christian culture. It impacts everything we do. We have radio, your former thing. We have 7 seminaries here in Dallas, and we don't realize that this impacts us. And smart people like yourself became a Christian at 17, Bart Ehrman, Michael Shermer, who's head of the Skeptic Society, was a Christian for a long time. Myself too at 17. We just didn't even know what hit us. Does that make sense?
Well, I think too, it's important to note that, you know, there is a bit of a superiority complex in tribes, and atheists are not immune from this. But, you know, I've met flat earth atheists, you know, I've met the aliens atheists, you know, I've met vaccine skeptic atheists, and, you know, getting what I consider to be getting correct one of the easiest questions in the universe does not mean you're all that astute about anything else. Speaking of Noah's Ark, I actually just finished narrating a book by Dr. Joshua Bowen, who's an Assyriologist.
Great, I saw that. Wonderful.
And it's called The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 2. And he gets into a lot of those old Sumerian myths that predate the Noah story. Beyond the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? I mean, this was a genre where the gods were angry or the gods were agitated, and then they punished the people, the pithy humans, by flooding and killing everyone and everything except for one select survivor who then repopulated the earth, and then there was regret, and they will never flood the earth again. And, you know, I was never taught that growing up. I never knew about ancient history. I never knew about ancient Sumerian myth and all the borrowings that were going on in the culture. I was insulated from that.
Well,
beyond
when
that,
I was...
Oh, I'm sorry. Beyond that, I, not an unintelligent person, I hope, believe that penguins walked 8,000 miles to board a giant boat in the desert of the Middle East built by a 500-year-old man using trees and tar. You know, it's one of those great examples where I didn't realize it, but I kind of sounded like an idiot. And so anyway, that's a whole other show, I guess, the Noah thing, but it's an interesting story. So.
When I was taking my Legends and Genesis class at University of North Carolina, I went to the professor who was a Catholic, and I said, what are the chances that Noah's flood, because I was a conservative fundamentalist, that 0 to 100, and he goes, Bill, you ask these unanswerable questions. He goes, talks to me like I'm an idiot. He goes, it has to be 0, idiot. And I was just like, but you don't understand. 40, like you were saying in your podcast, 46% of the people believe the earth's 6,000 years old, believe in a global flood. So it doesn't, the education system has failed us, but now we got to be fair. Atheists have the same problem. I was listening to Michael Winger talk about Aaron Ra, bless his holy name. Aaron Ra said that Jesus was a Jew is an unfulfilled prophecy. Well, just about any scholar in the world would say that. Plus, when we had Aaron on the show, he couldn't get the most basic things like the difference between modalism and Trinitarianism. The Council of Nicaea he got wrong, as did Richard Dawkins. So atheists have a real problem too. Don't you agree?
It's true. It's true. I mean, and many of us specialize. Many of us are better at one thing than another. I don't speak tons about Islam because my background is Christianity. This is a Christian heavy country. I live in the state of Oklahoma, which is, hugely Christian. So in their defense, if they were making an argument based on a premise that they knew nothing about, I think, they should be called out. If somebody asked them a question for which they did not know the answer and they said, I do not know, then in their defense, I think that's the honest answer. But it's, I think, often true that people who are skeptics of the Bible, especially people who came out of a religious culture, often know the Bible better than the people who have 3 of them on their nightstands and go to Sunday, go to meeting. In fact, I've become more and more convinced that the vast, vast, vast majority of cultural Christians, at least in this country, don't attend church really for reasons of theology, maybe on a surface level. They, believe there's a God and a Jesus and a heaven and a hell, etc. But they don't know their Bible. They don't know who wrote any of the books of the Bible. They can't play in they can't swim in those waters at all. What the church provides for them is a social construct, right? It's, if you want to explain much of it, it's family, geography, ritual, community, and comfort. These are human needs that the church does extremely well. And that's why I've met people, even who they become hugely skeptical of the doctrines, but they still want to go on Sunday because there are people who welcome them. And hey, it's good to see you. And we have communal music, and there's a sense of belonging. And if I have a crisis or need, somebody calls and they care. And you know, talk about community. It's not a religious thing, really. It's a human thing, but religion does it extremely well. And but I found that Bible illiteracy is rampant, and ironically, it's often rampant among the people who say it's absolutely true.
And you know, I'm tired of atheists taking the defense. And you know how they say, "Why should God let you into heaven?" Oh, because I'm a good person. Wrong. Why not us go on the offensive and say, "Hey, what are the 7 authentic letters of Paul?" And if you don't know Romans, Galatians, if you don't know those, let's go on the offensive. But okay, let me just be fair to the Christians here. Are you familiar? You're familiar, obviously, with the fine-tuning argument, right?
Yes.
Right from the get-go, you have the energy density of empty space that has to be just amazingly precise. It's just above 0, and it's like in order of a 10 to the 120th precision. You have the expansion rate of the universe that right from the get-go, if this thing isn't really precise, the universe collapses on itself and it's done. Or if it's not right the other way, if it goes too fast, then galaxies and so forth won't form. You have the ratios of the electromagnetic force and so forth that have to be just right. You have the mass of the electron, the proton.
I got you.
So you're familiar, and we find these arguments compelling at the club. What do you think of?
Well, I'm reminded of that Douglas Adams quote where he talks about the water that's in the pothole, and the water looks at the pothole and says, "Wow, you know, that's amazing. It looks like it was shaped perfectly just for me." And you know, I'd see that we are a result of the physical properties of the universe, but do I see it as an optimized universe? You know, trillions of galaxies and what, we're the center of all things here? Or is there another race that was created that we can't see or hear? Or, you know, was there another Adam and Eve on another planet and another Jesus visited them? You know, I think to myself, life is wondrous and it's amazing, but it's also, you know, you want to talk about fine tuning. Was it really fine tuned for us? This planet doesn't care what happens to us. People die in tsunamis to the tune of 300,000 people at a time. You got people dying of all kinds of, you got birth defects. You've got a sun that gives us cancer, for Pete's sake. You've got guinea worms that bore their way out of the eyeballs of human beings because that's how they survive. I mean, you know, you can find things that work very well in the mechanism of life, but I think these are natural things that happen, and I think there's a dark side to them, and I think nature doesn't really care whether or not we exist, but I'm fortunate that we do.
Well, and that's my speech is, there's things that show there might be a design. Give an example. Stephen Meyer, I know you're not a big fan, said that the chance of these 150 amino acids forming one protein, just to form a protein, is like 10 to the 77. In his book, Signature of the Cell, which you mentioned, there's 5 reasons why RNA will not assemble. So if you can't even get that off the ground, then, you know, where do you go? And
not to drag this on, but very quickly, Meyer is making a watchmaker argument. Let's say the fine-tuning argument's true. Whatever. My argument is not with the deists. You want to believe there was a cosmic wizard somewhere that spun the cosmos into existence? Great. But that deity is uninvolved. Like, Meyer's fine-tuner is not a personal God. He's busy talking. Plus, if he's talking about, you know, all of these genetic markers which prove the signature in the cell, what he's saying is, fine, that watchmaker hid his method for designing human life and the proof of his existence and handiwork until human beings could invent the microscope. And I think, you know, it's really a self-refuting argument if you're defending his personal God, and he is a Christian. You know, a personal God would be, and what he's talking about is these weird nebulous connected dots that he's connected himself. I mean, we see complexity, we see amazing things. I'm glad that we do exist in our proximity to or away from the sun, but it doesn't mean that we were placed there. It means that we were there as a result. And for any evidence of or example of beautiful design, turn your head 5 degrees, you'll find horrible design as well.
Well, and one of his go-to things, this is the Christian apologetic, the Cambrian explosion, where you have the arthropods, mollusca, the worms, all these things suddenly appear with no Precambrian precursors.
Over 25 million years, if you want to call it,
which is a blip in time.
Yeah.
So you have this terribly complex body parts that suddenly appear. On the flip side, you have the best argument for evolution is the endogenous retroviruses, which I'm sure you're familiar with. These are in lemurs, chimpanzees, and us. It just doesn't make any sense that God would implant these retroviruses in the DNA of all these things. It seems to be a great evidence for evolution, which Christians just totally blow off. But
I get the vibe that people are wishing that we would come out of maybe move back into other waters. I get that vibe.
Okay, yeah. I mean, just all I'm saying, I'll wrap it up here. And we live with the tension that there's the Cambrian, there's the endogenous, there's evidence on both sides of the deal.
I've got a kind of a technical question for you on a lot of your critiques of biblical critiques. While I may not agree with you, I certainly understand where you're coming from and why that is an issue for you. But then there's a couple more that really are head scratchers for me. This is actually from Gail Jordan's introduction. But she says, in what universe and under what circumstances is it remotely moral? You give some examples, but then she quotes 1 Timothy 5:2, and he says, and, quote, take the younger women as your own, end quote, 1 Timothy 5:2. And I'm thinking, wow, I don't kind of remember that one. And so I went to look it up, and I tried to even find that translation. And it seems like she's paraphrasing, but also leaving out a very important part of the verse. Let me read it to you. This is standard translation. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he was your father. And treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and here's the direct part of the quote, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. So, she's implying that there's some kind of, sexual or abusive crime going on or something with the younger women. But it's, the actual verse says you're to treat them as sisters and even specifies absolute purity. So was this just... are you familiar with that passage? Has anybody else asked you about this one?
It sounds like a mistake. It sounds like she was referencing the verses out of the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's what I was
expecting. It sounds like she's referencing the Numbers passage.
Yeah, that's what I thought it was going to be. It was going to be an Old Testament reference to slavery or
and that's fair. But I didn't myself realize that. The conversations we have are rooted in the commands to treat women as property, to kidnap the virgins for yourselves, the submission of women, how women were devalued even in slavery to half the worth of a man, blah, blah, blah. Her tying of that into the book of Timothy, that may be an error, and it may be something that I need to look at and address. I do stand by her representation of how the Bible approaches women, because for every honor your wife verse that you find or love your wife verse that you'll find a lot more that essentially subjugate and even enslave women. And I resist any claim that the Bible is pro-woman. But I think if the wrong chapter and verse are in there in the introduction, that's something that needs to be addressed and fixed. And that's something I'd like to address and bring up with Gail and make right.
Yeah, and again, this is from the introduction, not from you, so I didn't know if you were even familiar with that. But in most of the cases, while I don't agree, with the characterization of it, I do see where you would have an issue with it. I can understand the point that is trying to be made. This one, I think you're right. I think it must have been a wrong verse put in here.
And I think if I'm to be, somebody brought another, like an error, there's a missing word in one of the chapters, and it's a critical word.
So
And,
will you admit then that the book is not inerrant? Would you just go ahead and
Oh
admit
God,
it?
yeah. I mean, I'm a human being
That's
with
a joke.
flaws. Yeah. I'm not perfect. And I
Seth,
think if we're to be people who are going to live honestly, if we find out that there's a mistake that may have been made, I think the right thing to do is to go in and to shore that up and to fix it. And goodness, I want to be honest about. I don't want anything dishonestly presented in.
Well, let me also make an announcement that Seth talked to me about this, and I just want everybody to know. Usually our book club runs 2 hours. Seth has got another appointment coming up, so we're going to have about
Let's
an
go
hour or maybe
8:15. I can probably go
okay
8:15 if that's
to 8:15 Central Time. So I do want to get to some of the other questions. I've got a whole page here. I want to get time to ask. I know
I'll try
that,
to shore up my answers. I tend to be a little bloviate. Forgive me.
but I'm enjoying the elaboration as well. So I hate to cut you short and try to say true, false, or multiple
We'll split
choice.
the difference.
We'll do that. So do we want to, Daniel, did you want to ask a question first, or do you want to go ahead and let some of our other members?
I actually have a question that comes from Mike, who's a Christian. He wanted me to ask it for him, but it dovetails with something that I have myself. And so I'll ask Mike's question, and then I'll throw mine in there. And Seth, you can take it wherever you want to. Mike said that he's asking you, Seth, do you think science has an answer for all the important questions of life? Well, you can start with that one, and then I'll ask mine. Mine's pretty simple too.
Well, science is not like science isn't like a fishbowl where you drop your hand in and grab the answer. Science is a process. Science is a way of thinking. And what's that line? I'd rather, oh gosh, it'll come to me in just a moment. I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. It's a great line. But science is just a mindset. Let's test and let's retest. 1 and 2 year olds are scientists. They're testing their world. They're trying to figure out how things work. They're going to make it and break it and mold it and change it. And so science being a process, a method for trying to understand the world, it's not like, well, science knows everything, because we know it doesn't. We know that science has to make adjustments whenever new information is found. That's what I love. Like dogmatic religions have been selling the same dogmas. They refuse to change. I've talked to people who will proudly say, no matter what you show me, I will never change my mind on this. What do we say? What other thing do we say that about? Like, what other part of our lives do we say, if I got new information, I still would want to believe the old thing? We just don't
Politics,
money.
Well, I think you're right in the sense that beliefs that are attached to our identity can be very much that way, where we feel that an attack on the idea is an attack on the identity. And in that way, politics may be right. But when we look at science as a process, the fact that it doesn't know everything's fine. Do I like not having all the answers? No. But does it mean I'm going to fill in a blank? Absolutely not. I think we just continue to do the best we can to test and retest to explore our world. But science is a process. It's not a fishbowl with all the answers and we reach in and grab them.
Right. Okay. Following up on that. Thank you for that, Seth. Following up with that, my own question. You, and forgive me because I didn't cite where this comes from, but you'll probably recognize this. This is your quote. And you say, to make things biblically aligned, the square peg of science is pounded into the round hole of religion, and after hours of clumsy banging, apologists declare, see it fits. And the broader context, to be fair to you, is talking about science and religion. And you can backfill the context if I don't want to take you out of context in that regard. But I have this nugget, and I want to see how you might respond to this. I have a book called According to, it's 100 Years of Nobel Prizes, written in 2005 by Baruch Abba Shalev, a review of Nobel Prizes awarded between 1901, the last century, 1901 and 2000. And Shalev notes that 65% of Nobel Prize laureates have identified Christianity in its various forms as their religious preference. That includes 423 prizes from the last 100 years. And he goes on to further diversify it. And he says, overall, Christians have won a total of 78% of all the Nobel Prizes in peace, 72% in chemistry, 65% in physics, 62% in medicine, 54% in economics, and 49.5% in all the literature awards. So in light of what you said about Christians, or maybe it's apologists, I don't know, banging these clumsily banging pegs together, how do you see that? Like somebody, I'm thinking also of James Clerk Maxwell, who discovered electricity and magnetism. And when he made the Cambridge laboratory, he put Psalm 111:2 over the door of the lab, which says, "Great are the works of the Lord. They are discovered by all, or they are studied by all who delighted them." So I'm wondering what your thought is about the Christians of the past and present, who are scientists and who are, solidly biblical in their outlook. What do you think?
I always think about Francis Collins at the Human Genome Project, right? I mean, he is a proponent of evolution, the fact and the overwhelming avalanche of evidence supporting evolution, but he's also a Christian. Well, he is an incredibly smart guy, but he has made I call it the place in the brain where the weird stuff lives. And I think we can all be guilty of this. But did those specific scientists, the Nobel laureates and the people who've won awards for physics, et cetera, were they operating in a field where they had proven God, or were they simply applying their intellect and expertise and education in ways that were relevant and evidence-based, but weren't directly attached to the God question? It's almost an argument from authority, right? Well, Dr. So-and-so believe, Dr. Stephen Meyer says that there must have been an intelligent designer. Well, I think the question really needs to be, have they proven with replicable results in a way that we can all see and analyze and understand and accept? Have they proven the existence of a God? And so I think that's the question, not whether or not they're smart or whether they're experts in a specific field, but what does the evidence have that they have provided? And if you can show me somebody who won the Nobel Prize because they proved God, that's a whole other conversation.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think any of them are. I've talked to people I've talked to a moonwalking astronaut. I've talked to Hubble Space Telescope scientists myself on our podcast. I don't think any of them, even the top tier scientists that are out there who write and publish, I don't think anybody is really asserting that they're able to prove God. I don't think there's a Nobel laureate classification for proofs of God. When you mean proof, do you mean like absolute, infallible, I can't believe any other way? Do you think that God has to be demonstrated that way in order for God to exist? Is that what you're kind of saying?
Well, if we're talking about a
right?
benevolent personal God, I'd like to draw it back to the Christian God. I think that the idea that we have to have discussions on the internet about whether this deity exists and who he is, what he wants, what's going on with him, and the fact that we're clumsily sort of, trying to figure out how do cells connect and what do microscopes tell us, and look at our distance from the sun, and let's go over here and examine this, these patterns and these types of, the hierarchy in the food chain and the dominance of men. Let's look at all these different things. And we're all trying to solve this Rubik's Cube. The fact that an ostensibly personal, benevolent, loving God would sit on his hands and watch us do all this stuff when even the experts can't agree on the basics, to me, that's just another piece of evidence that no benevolent God exists. Maybe a sadistic one, maybe an impersonal one, but not one that genuinely cared. Because a God that would genuinely care would come and say, all right, this is exactly who I am. Without a doubt, without refutation, there's no question, 7+ billion people on planet Earth, you now know beyond a shadow of a doubt perfectly. I don't think that's unreasonable if you're a perfect God who says he cares about us.
Do you think you'd recognize the evidence if he did come?
Well, if there is a God, I want to know that. If there is a deity and I'm living an honest life, I want to know that.
Do you think you'd recognize him is what I'm saying?
If I define a God as a being with God-like powers, would that be an omnipotent God or not quite omnipotent? Would it be a benevolent or malevolent God? There are so many other questions. Would it be the kind of God I would want to follow, or would I be afraid of that God and run the other direction because I didn't want to be destroyed? But I think, would I recognize God-like attributes if I saw them? I'd like to think so. And this idea that we're looking under rocks and listening to apologists who can't agree with each other about what God looks like, what God said, who translated it right, which holy text does that, and the thousands of splintered denominations with everybody else saying that the other people are biblically incorrect. It's a circus. And I really feel like if a God cared enough, this would be settled. There would be no question. We would have no conversation. There would be no atheist Christian debate club, because God would have come down and made it absolutely certain, clear, without question, without doubt, perfectly. I think that's reasonable.
Can I share a little anecdote with you? I'm not going to say it's going to conclusively change your mind or prove anything. But you say in chapter 11 of your book, you said something that touched my life. I'm not saying this for sympathy or anything, but when I was in high school, I lost my father to suicide. And you had mentioned a section of Bill Maher's Religulous movie, where he was interviewing a Christian and asking him if heaven is a better place and if you're going there. And Bill said, "Well, why don't you kill yourself?" And I think, and you had said that you thought that Maher's point was a good one. And so my question would be that as a former Christian, I was surprised, because I would assume that you would understand that a reason that a Christian wouldn't take their own life is because of the nature of living for Christ and living for others, that we're here not so much for ourselves or what we can get out of this world, but we're living for God and for other people. And so my dad's death had a devastating long-term effect on our family, of course. And I think anybody that would take their own life would also negatively impact other people. And I think that just misses the complete point of the Gospels and what Christianity is all about. Because I know in the 20th century, Albert Camus, the existentialist, advocated that suicide was a noble thing. He was an atheist, of course, but I wouldn't say that all because the world is so nihilistically inclined to doom and death that all atheists would ascribe to suicide being a noble thing. So I was a little surprised that it seemed like you agreed with Maher's point to some degree, but I don't want to mischaracterize.
I don't agree with all of the film, and your point is a fair one, and it's one that I can see your objection and I understand it. My larger point was that the people who continue to talk and talk and talk about how they cannot wait for this beautiful, unimaginably perfect heaven of color and light and music and not a blemish, no pain, no sorrow, only joy, the reunion with loved ones. They talk all the time in this sort of abstract way about why they can't wait to get there. And then they live their lives trying to prevent death.
Right.
And that was the larger point I was trying to make. Was it a bit clumsy? I mean, I'll receive that criticism, sure. But I think that, my larger point, if I may, was that I feel like a lot of the people who say out of one side of their mouth they can't wait to go to heaven spend an awful lot of time and energy freaking out about danger and death.
So, yeah, I would agree with you that there's probably a lot of people. I mean, even the Bible says, Jesus says, a lot of people will say to me in that day, "Lord, Lord, didn't we do all these things in your name?" And he will say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." So, and though at times I think in some places you might be a little caustic in the way you do things, but I do think you address a significant point.
I'm guilty. I'm guilty.
About there is and I as a believer I was an adult convert. I've been a Christian for almost 30 years. But I've been guilty of a lot of the things, the platitudes and the empty phrases that maybe I didn't know what I was saying, or I was just going along with what other people were saying. So in one sense, that I'm not. I think you have some valid observations in some sense about the shallowness of thought. But we here at the book club try to be a little bit different, and a little bit more thoughtful than that. So
that's a fair question.
But I appreciate your response.
I don't mind being challenged on it. I really don't. I do appreciate it.
This was early on. Julie asked, "What do you consider the important questions?"
I was asking that in relation to what Mike said.
Okay.
Mike just said, you kind of threw out the important. Does science answer all the important questions? And I responded with, what do you consider the important questions? And if you look directly below that, Michael answered.
Yeah, I got you. Did you want to ask Seth something, Julie, while you're live there?
No, I talked to Seth enough.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks, Julie. All right. Ron asked, Who is qualified to judge whether someone is a hard target? Or Ron, do you want to ask your question or clarify what that means? You can unmute and ask Seth your question. I want to make sure you get it the way you wanted it.
Well, I'm not sure I understand my question, but we'll give it a try.
Well, if you have another one, you can ask. Go ahead.
Well, very early in the discussion about cancel culture, Seth, you said, well, there may be those people who deserve to be hard targets. Those weren't your exact words.
Yeah.
And perhaps the inference is that they should be canceled. And I wonder who's qualified. Is it just a question of what the majority of people believe as far as who should or should not be canceled?
Well, I don't think it's all that difficult to look at a man named like Alex Jones. Alex Jones, who is essentially a hate preacher and a peddler of conspiracy and misinformation and strife and bigotry. And even if you're a Christian, he stands against all the best teachings of Jesus Christ. Then going and saying that the Sandy Hook school massacre was a false flag or operation and all of the people involved were crisis actors and no children died, and essentially trampling on the graves of the children and insulting the grieving families that leave behind. I think you and I both look at that and neither one of us say, well, this person's misunderstood. You know, if we just saw them in context or we gave them a chance, or maybe this is just a one-off, you can look at somebody like that and you can be like, no, this is a toxic, awful, hateful human being doing real damage and spreading real hate and destruction. So he's a hard target. So I think as moral, reasonable creatures, we can make a judgment call. I'm not saying it's a perfect call, but
for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you.
Different than somebody I graze against on the internet who says something that I don't like or even insults me in some way. And then I equate them with Alex Jones, or I say they're a Nazi or there's something else. You know, there are differences, but I think it's not all that hard for us to identify the hard targets when we see them.
Phil, you can unmute. Thank you for that.
You'll accuse me of playing the Hitler card. Is by what standard can we say that we absolutely know that what Hitler did was wrong?
Well, it's not difficult to identify harm when it is done. And this gets us into a whole other conversation about our evolved moral processes, pro-social behaviors, cooperation in the evolutionary model, et cetera. A lot of people, they don't realize how condescending and insulting it is when they say, well, Seth, if you don't believe in God, how do you know rape and murder are wrong? And it's so condescending when they say it. And it's a little terrifying because they're actually telling me that if it wasn't for their deity, they might be rapists and murderers. But I think we can identify harm to a member of our species or another species as part of, our existence on this planet. Identifying harm is not difficult. So if you see Hitler, who is torturing and shooting and gassing and hanging all of, 6 million Jews, et cetera, we as creatures with an evolved ethical system can look at harm being done and identify it. We can look at Alex Jones and see harm being done. We can see the caustic and the cruel and the hateful, and we can see harm is being done to someone else as it might have been done to me. We can feel empathy and concern and compassion and outrage about it, and then we can engage to try to solve the problem and prevent it from happening in the future. So acting to minimize harm, I think that's I don't think that's a tall order for us.
Well, I struggle with the question of whether or not Hitler was in fact being very faithful to a secular humanist point of view as advocated by Darwin and Martin.
If you look at the belt buckles of the Nazi SS, it said Gott mit uns, God with us. Adolf Hitler invoked God in Mein Kampf and had aligned himself with the Catholic Church, some would argue strategically, but he believed and preached that he was doing God's good work by eliminating the Jews. Now, I don't say that he did this because he was a Christian, nor do I align Christians with Hitler. That's not fair. But I was a devout Christian. I loved people. I was nothing like Hitler, so I don't make that correlation. But Hitler himself was not an atheist, and he was not he didn't do what he did because he had read Darwin's Origins of on the Origin of Species. He did so because he was a psychopath. But he did invoke the name of God, and he actually imprinted God's name on the uniforms of the Nazi SS as he carried out mass genocide.
I've actually, if I may interject here for just a moment, I've actually had the as a Jew, people ask how can you be a Jewish atheist? I don't believe in a God, but I will always be culturally and racially Jewish. My ancestry is Jewish on both matriarchal sides, all the way back on both sides of my family. So I will always be a Jewish girl, regardless of whether or not I believe. And I've had the conversation about Hitler before. I tell people Hitler did not kill the Jews because they did or did not go to temple. He killed them simply because they existed, because he felt he was doing God's work to wipe out a race that did not believe in the same God he believed in. And having members who died and also survived Hitler's Nazi world in World War II, it's a subject that, like, I'm kind of burning right now because it's a subject that hits very, very close to home for me.
I think we have to be clear that we're not saying, or at least I'm not saying, Hitler did what he did because he was motivated by Christianity. I think he aligned himself with God because he believed his crusade was a holy crusade. But I think he did what he did because he was a psychopath and he was a madman.
Oh, I agree. I agree with you. I totally agree with you on that. I do. But there is a part of me that also believes he didn't do it just because people did or did not go to temple. He did it because he believed the Jews were impure, that they were not of the same God and they were not of the same belief as him.
You know what's interesting, if I can totally segue quickly, you say that you are Jewish, but you are a non-believer. That's a really interesting case study in a function that religions provide for people in a social construct, right? We're back to family, geography, ritual, community, and comfort. Roughly half of practicing Jews say that they right now either don't believe in a God or they have some doubts, right? I mean, that's a big number, but they still participate in some way in a Jewish faith because they love the culture, they love the music, they love the traditions, the bar and the bat mitzvah, and it's part of the framework for the human existence for them. So they've been able to take a lot of the woo out of the equation, but they've been able to take the ritual and community part of it and latch on and embrace that. I think there's merit to that. I think it explains a lot of the power of religion and religious communities because they do serve that function. And we in the atheist movement, we struggle because, we're thousands of years behind when it comes to creating a community net for people to fall into. And it's hard, it's hard to ask somebody to really question their faith when the implications aren't really, there may not be a deity out there. It's more about, will I lose my community? Will I lose this feeling of belonging? Will I be rejected by my tribe? There's all these other sort of social reinforcers. I find that's an interesting conversation.
That's a good
Seth,
point.
We have a question from Phil. I think he's going to talk about. Go ahead, Phil. I won't fill in your gaps. Go ahead and ask Seth your question.
Hi, is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
I've had trouble with my microphone in the past, so I just wanted to make sure everything was cool. I kind of had the same question that I asked pretty much every atheist that I've ever encountered. And that is that if God does not exist, then all we have is natural law. All we have is the natural universe. There's no such thing as a supernatural. So if all we have is natural law, then our brains were pretty much created, if you want to call it that. They arose out of natural law, out of matter and energy coming together and organizing itself. And so what we have is a long chain of cause and effect that has to do with natural law and, electrical impulses in the brain, chemical reactions. That's all we have. That's all we are. And if that's the case, then that natural law and that long chain of cause and effect is the reason why we have what we experience as thoughts or beliefs or knowledge inside of our head. Knowledge is nothing more than brain chemistry and natural law determining what it is that we believe to be true.
By the way, Phil, Alvin Plantinga articulated what you're saying. It's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Right. If we're evolved for survival, and what you're articulating, just how in the world can we trust our brains? What do you think of that, Seth?
So what this basically comes down to is that materialistic determinism destroys human knowledge. It destroys epistemology. It makes it so that there's no way that man can have a basis for epistemology whatsoever.
So what do you think,
So
Seth?
there's no reason to believe that anything that we believe about the external world is true. We have no reason to believe that there's such a thing as the external world. Therefore, science is now completely impossible. Science is destroyed by materialistic determinism. It's the very science that claims to understand the natural law is actually destroyed by natural law if there's no supernatural intervention in the creation of man, mankind.
I think that's an awfully long leap, because now when you're talking about supernatural, now you're talking about something that you say science, or most people will say science supernatural and not natural. It cannot be effectively measured by science, and good luck nailing that down. Everybody's going to have a different perspective or definition. What's it look like? Spirits, what's the spirit look like? What's their name? What are their characteristics? Is it a god, several gods, he, she, it, of what faith, blah, blah, blah. But I think, the problem of hard solipsism does remain a challenge. How do I know anything beyond my own mind? Am I just a brain in a vat? And I think that's a significant challenge. But I also understand that we work with what we have, and you and I exist in a universe where the laws of physics are the same for you as they are for me. Light travels at exactly the same speed for you as it does for me.
How can we know that?
How
can we know that if all of our thoughts are determined by natural law? How can we know that there's such a thing as the speed of light? How can we know that the natural laws are the same for you and for me? How do we know that there even is a you and a me?
If the laws that you and I are using that are the same for both of us are the reason that this Zoom call exists, right? It's if you and I sit in a car and we're driving at the same speed, the laws of physics are the same for you and me. Let's say we live in a simulation. The laws of this simulation are the same for you and for me. And I think, if I may, I'm not sure that this is a convincing argument for the supernatural, because now we're saying, well, in order for this, because I consider to be the natural world slightly implausible, or perhaps even more than slightly implausible, we now must add a magical element to make it more plausible. I don't find that a convincing position. Is it difficult to solve the problem of how do we know anything beyond our own minds? That's something the philosophers will probably deal with forever. But I do know that I'm going to exist and measure and try to find the truth in the reality in which I exist. And we have a shared reality where we can measure things, and those measurements are the same for you as they are for me.
See, I think there's a kind of a drop in the line of reasoning here. I think we're kind of missing the point. If everything that we believe is determined by chemistry and physics, then we have no reason to believe that there is such a thing as you and me. We have no reason to believe that we're even thinking beings. We have no reason to believe that there are rules out there that are somehow being imposed on us from some kind of condition that we might live in that may be completely different than the world we think we live in.
I just disagree with the premise of your question. I don't think that those conditions describe what you say they describe. I disagree with the premise of your question.
Hey, by the way, Seth, we only got a few more minutes. Can someone else ask a question?
Yeah, let me come back to a question I had that I'll wanted to ask you. You mentioned, I went back to watch your 2017 talk in Toronto that was like the genesis of the book. And, when I initially looked at the book, I'm thinking, I first thought, well, this just seems to be a collection of memes without the cool pictures. And then I'm thinking, well, no, there's more to it than that. But then when I watched your talk, I said, well, there's the missing pictures right there on the slide deck. But you did mention two people in that talk in Toronto that coincidentally were guest authors also on the Atheist and Christian Book Club here at our club. You mentioned Stephen Meyer, and then you also mentioned Aaron Ra. And one of the concerns I had with the way you talked about Stephen Meyer in that particular talk in Toronto, you said that Stephen Meyer has no firsthand knowledge or training in molecular biology, so obviously he decides to write a book on the subject. It's called Signature in the Cell. It has been roundly tossed out. And then you went on to kind of, criticize the book.
Soundly and roundly criticize the book.
Another group of apologists spends all of its time explaining how God is indeed proven. He's all around us. It's so obvious. How could you miss it? Like this guy, Dr. Stephen Meyer. He's a Christian who works for the Discovery Institute, which is a religious organization posing as a scientific one. He has no firsthand training or degree in molecular biology, so obviously he decided to write a book on the subject. It's called Signature in the Cell. It's been roundly tossed out.
The bottom line is, you implied that he had no professional training, and do you know what his degree is?
No, I didn't say he had no professional training.
Well, technically, it was not in molecular biology.
Yeah, I'm saying he's writing outside of his field. But more important was the point that I made, that his position is not embraced by the vast majority of experts in the field in which he is writing. He's essentially stands.
Again, that's another appeal to authority, I think.
I think if we are looking at people who are testing and retesting, who are taking those claims and saying, well, is there anything to it or not? People who do function, who do play in that sandbox, who are doing the tests and say, no, we actually don't find this evidence. Stephen Meyer is posing as a scientist, or positioning himself as a scientist.
Well, his degree, you know where his degree is from?
I can't remember.
Okay, he has a PhD in philosophy of science from Cambridge.
Thank you.
Okay, so
forgive my memory, but yeah, I've got it written.
Okay, right. So it's kind of an unkind caricature, is like he has no training in this field, so he decides to write a book on it or something. So
I think he is an apologist first and a scientist after. I think he is starting with the answer and now trying to demonstrate why his answer is correct. And I think the quote unquote answers that he is providing stand in contrast to others in the field who I believe may be more credible and more centered, more laser focused on that particular
I understand
subject.
that the purpose of the book is not to get into the details, and maybe there would be another venue that you could get into the details on and stuff like that. So I'm not trying to make the book something it was not ever intended to be. I understand the purpose of it, but that said,
you have to think
what we try to do at the book club is we try to, we don't have PhDs in the field, but we do try to fairly look at the argument. So to contrast that with your friend Aaron Ra, he was also a guest author in person here at the book club, and we looked at his book on evolution. Now, no time did we try to denigrate the ideas in the book based on the fact that he only had a high school diploma. Because the ideas that he has should stand and fall on their own, not based on how much education he had. Now we did have, we did criticize the book. We talked about that he didn't have any not a single footnote or endnote, and he explained that his publisher didn't allow him to include those. But we tried to interact with his best arguments in the book and then question him on that, but not again this appeal to authority that you have to have a degree in the topic. So it just seemed like to me, and maybe you were more careful in the book than you were in the talk, but it seemed like you were not very charitable in how you described Stephen Meyer. I know you don't agree with him, which is fine, but the implication was he didn't have any education or something. PhD in philosophy of science.
Any education.
Well, that was the implication. He writes a book on something that he has no training or knowledge about.
I think in my experience with Stephen Meyer, this is an opinion that has been, I'll admit, cultivated over a series of years, well before the speech in the book. I see Stephen Meyer as an apologist first. He is a preacher first. He is trying to sell the ID argument first, and he is then going out and finding. But his findings do not stand in the majority opinion of people who do what he does. And as I also said in the speech and in the book, his whole premise is bogus because signature in the cell implies that God would sign his handiwork in a way that people wouldn't be able to understand or detect for thousands upon thousands of years. God would have to be an incredible prankster to put a signature in the cell when primitive human beings...
He works for the Discovery Institute, which is very fair and balanced, wouldn't you say?
No, I would not.
Yeah, but I think that's maybe a mischaracterization. Also, one of the things that we get hit with a lot as Christians, as the more science advances, the more evidence we have that there is no God. And I think part of the reason that Stephen Meyer is the point. One of the points he's trying to make is that sometimes the more science that we have, the more that we get, the more evidence that we have that there is a God. And so it's not like that God has to wait, like I think you said 200,000 years before he can reveal his signature. It's more like as advances in science and in various types of science gives oftentimes more evidence, not less evidence for the existence of God.
Or God, I think that's his point. Or God is sitting back watching humans have to develop tools that ostensibly prove him, when God, with heaven and hell in the balance, eternity in the balance, the great questions in the balance, essentially is sitting out waiting on what? Why would God need Stephen Meyer? These are larger, I think, and salient questions about benevolence, if there was a deity who genuinely cared and was personal. And some people will be like, well, what would it take for you to be convinced there was a God? My first answer was, well, good evidence. But my answer now is God knows. Like, I don't even have to know what God would need to convince me, because if God knows everything, God would know exactly what it would take to convince me and all the other 7 billion people on the planet, and that benevolent deity would have already done it. He wouldn't need Stephen Meyer to write a book telling me what the science says, which is better than what the science said yesterday, et cetera, et cetera. God would have already had that personal encounter and made it totally clear. And I think that's fair.
Seth, it's 8:15. You got to run.
Forgive me. I do. I do. I appreciate Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Just one quick question if you want to take it. If not, fine. You can do it one answer if you want. That you criticize a lot of things in the Old Testament. I won't go into all the verses and stuff, but do you think that anything in the Old Testament actually happened? The slavery, all the laws.
Do I think that fiction often is rooted in factual times, cultures, places? Of course. Did certain cities exist? Yeah. Were certain laws in place? Yeah. But do I think that the Old Testament and the New Testament is reliable history? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't think it's tenable historically, scientifically, or morally. And
so there wasn't any slave trade really going on as the Old Testament describes it.
Yeah, there were slaves. It was part of the culture.
But as described in the Old Testament, that didn't happen.
Yeah, men and women were traded. There were debt and chattel slaves. This was part of Babylonian culture. It was part of the Sumerian culture. It was reflected in the writings of the Old Testament. It's an echo of what was happening during that specific time period in human history. But I don't think that the specific stories that are being told are reliable stories. We don't even know who authored the Old Testament.
By the way,
all the laws like...
Let me break in at this point. Seth, it's been so great to have you at our Atheist and Christian Book Club. Thank you so much for coming back and
I'll let you guys dismantle me. Just take me apart bit by bit. Enjoy yourselves. Enjoy the taste of what is left of my carcass. And,
hey, great job. I want to remind everybody, please go to SethAndrews.comn for more information. Please check out True Stories podcast as well as The Thinking Atheist if you're not already familiar with it. And follow up with Seth there. Thank you so much. And what's your next book? Last question. What's your next book you're working on?
Right now I'm just focusing on True Stories and trying to honestly, I needed a distraction, something light and fun and the big questions and the world's problems, those are important, but I needed balance. So that's what I'm working on these days. And, if something else comes up, we'll talk about it then. But it's been an honor to be here. I appreciate the challenges and the questions and the goodwill.
Seth.
Thanks,
and you
Seth.
guys be safe. Thanks for
And remember, we do agree on 42. We do agree.
And honestly, I really do feel like this is a room of people with shared values. We want goodness. We love people. I think we're all on the same team. We have some disagreements here and there, but I think we have so much more in common than we ever had in disagreement. And I'd be honored to buy any of you a drink, even though I don't drink. I'll buy you a non-alcoholic beverage. Okay. So thank you.
We really appreciate you, Seth, and hope to have you on sometime in the future. Now, before anybody goes, I have a few things I want to announce. I want to announce our next book club author.
I got a jet. May all be good.
Thanks so much, Seth. And I also want to tell you guys, if you're interested about something that you might find fascinating, some of you have been following the Church of Scientology and some of the things that are going on with the Danny Masterson trial and with I just got to do an interview with the former head of the Church of Scientology's Office of Special Affairs. This is the feared and dreaded Office of Special Affairs of Church of Scientology, Mike Render.
Only L. Ron Hubbard's words are valid in Scientology, and he's dead. So he can't write any revisions of anything that he did. They're just stuck with that, and they will keep doing exactly that until someone from outside the organization stops them from doing it. L. Ron Hubbard convinced or convinces Scientologists that he has the answers to all the problems of mankind, he and he alone. The inner elite core of Scientology is called the Sea Organization, and when you join the Sea Organization, as I did when I was 18, right after graduating high school, you sign a contract, and I say contract, but it's called the Sea Org contract, for 1 billion years.
That's going to be on a podcast released this Monday at apologeticsprofile.com if you want to go there. For the very first time in a public broadcast, I'm going to be talking about the $9.5 million lawsuit that the Church of Scientology filed against me and against Watchman Fellowship. I'm going to release some things I don't talk about generally in public. Mike Render's role and the Church of Scientology's role in the lawsuit. Our office is being infiltrated by operatives from the Church of Scientology. Mike's going to talk and explain why that's the technology of L. Ron Hubbard and, more importantly, the current leader, David Miscavige. Mike Render has just written a book. He's out now. He's come out of Scientology. He's written a book called 1 Billion Years, which is this contract he signed to serve the Church of Scientology for the next 1 billion years. And so be looking for that Monday morning, and that's going to be at apologeticsprofile.com. Our next guest author is going to be an attorney, Mark Lanier, who wrote the book Atheism on Trial. Now, Mark Lanier has been hailed as the, quote, superstar among plaintiffs' lawyers by the National Law Journal. He's an acclaimed trial lawyer and the founder of the Lanier Law Firm with offices in New York, Texas, and California. His reputation has been widely recognized with national accolades and is based on his courtroom battles with powerhouses such as Viatech and also Toyota. As well as being featured prominently in dozens of newspapers and journals, Lanier is a frequent guest on television news shows such as CNBC's Squawk Box, Fox News' Your World with Neil Cavuto, and Fox Business News, Varney and Company with Stuart Varney. Mark has exhibited a lifelong commitment to Christianity, and his undergraduate education in biblical languages have nurtured his passion for developing his faith and sharing it with others. In 2010, he founded the Lanier Theological Library, one of the nation's largest private theological collections, which houses over 70,000 books, biblical artifacts, and museum-quality reproductions of ancient documents. He's an ordained minister. He teaches a weekly 750-member Sunday school class at Champion Forest Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. He also founded the Christian Trial Lawyers Association, a network of principled attorneys who minister to others through civic-minded endeavors. Now, on December 1st, the first Thursday of December, he'll be joining us to talk about his latest book, Atheism on Trial. I want to encourage you guys, we'll put it up on atheistchristianbookclub.com, but we will put up the links to be able to get the book. We already have found a video alternative to the book. If you don't have time to read the book, you can watch him lecture on the same topic and be prepared to come back, and we will be meeting next December. So again, we try to alternate. We did an atheist book this month, and for December we will try to do the Christian book, Atheism on Trial. Does anybody, we have a question from Julie, I think. Julie?
Yep. Will you have the links to like the video and where you can find the book and all that the same way you did with Seth's book on the website?
Yes. If you go to atheistchristianbookclub.com, it'll take a day or two to get that up. It'll say next meeting, and there will be links to the book and the audio edition of the book and whatever. So, but we realize in today's culture, a lot of us are really, really busy and don't have time to read the book. We sometimes try to have focused chapters, so you don't have to, especially a longer book, you don't have to have to read 400 pages, but read these 3 chapters. That's going to be our focus. And we also always try to have, if possible, a video alternative. So if you can spend an hour or so watching the video, you'll be a lot more prepared to come in and have this discussion.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions before we dismiss?
I was just going to say, Seth interviewed Joshua Brown, the Atheist Handbook. And if you want to know about the Old Testament and have Seth's beautiful voice narrate, that's a great book. Joshua Brown is a former Christian who is very even keel. He tries to be very fair, but he does have the standard.
That is a volume 2 of the Atheist Guide or Handbook to the Old Testament, something like that. Handbook to the Old Testament.
That Seth narrates. But
maybe this should be one of our books.
Absolutely. And this guy's a real scholar. He's not just a propagandist.
Well, you know what? Go ahead, Julie.
No. Say what you have to say, and I'm just letting you know I have something to add.
Sure. We always, we want to try to have the best representatives, the best, sometimes there's a temptation that we, do I want the best atheist book or do I want the one that's easiest to refute in a book club, So we all thought, but I really do want to hear the best arguments. I want to hear the best representatives. And
this will be a good one, and it should answer
from
Dan's
the Christian
question
perspective as well. I did want to say something good about Seth in his absence. One of the things he said, if you didn't get a chance to finish the book, at the end of the book, he said this: I have genuinely been trying to reduce the level of my snark in my activism, especially online. And let me say that I certainly admire respect. I definitely struggle with that problem myself. From a Christian perspective, I'm always assuming that sarcasm is one of the spiritual gifts. That is something to be emulated and tried out, but actually we do want to, and Seth did a wonderful job, treat people respectfully, and from a Christian perspective, treat others as you would have them treat you. And so Seth demonstrated that, and we want to do that in the club. Now, Julie, you had something?
A couple of things. First, I just want to touch on that. Agreed with that, Phil. There is such a thing as respectful sarcasm, which I strive when I am being sarcastic to be respectful at all costs. That being said, I also fight the snark because as lovely as you people have been tonight, let's face it, sometimes atheists talking to Christians can devolve very quickly, as Bill knows from being on both sides of that coin. And it's very hard to be respectful when you feel like you're being attacked, right? My goal in sharing my non-belief, if you will, is to just educate people. One of the biggest questions, and there are other atheists in this group who can testify to this, one of the one question that I think I get asked more than anything is how can you be moral without God? Right? How can I have morals and ethics if I don't believe in a deity? Well, simple, because my mom and dad raised me to believe that killing another human being is the wrong thing to do. And I even the Christians here, there are plenty of people who have killed in the name of Christ, so to speak, right? I mean, just think about David Koresh and Heaven's Gate, and I'm not going to devolve into that whole.
But Phil did have a good point when he said, if we're the evolutionary argument against natural, if we're just evolved to go survive and so forth, and if our brains are just how in the world? And the thing is, how can we trust our brains when there is so much bias, when there is so much
right, exactly,
and that's a good point, Phil.
But Julie, you're right that a lot of Christians, I've heard it myself, and if you're an atheist, then that means the default is you must be immoral. Right. And Seth dealt with that a little bit tonight too about.
Well, I'm not going to give you.
I think the better thing the better way to ask the question is because I know atheists who are, I think, more moral than some Christians I know. The question is, have you properly grounded that, or how do you ground that morality? Well, that's an academic question that would be great to talk about. But if you couch the question as if this person is somehow immoral or not a good person just because of their worldview, we're not going to have a good conversation at that point.
Exactly, and that's what I'm getting at. I can be respectful to people who are believers. As Seth pointed out, I have friends of mine who still believe in God, and they know that I don't, and we agree to disagree on that point, and we're still great friends. We just don't discuss religion. Because at the end of the day, now I mean, I've been an atheist now for 20 years, but some of these friends I've known for longer, right? Do I end a 30-year friendship? No, you don't. You hopefully are able to come together to a peaceful understanding and move forward with both of your lives and still remain friends. That all being said, I'm not going to give you guys my resume, but I volunteer for so many different organizations, some that are based in religion, because it's causes that I believe in, and others that have nothing to do with religion, right? Because it's just who I am as a human being. Not because I believe that there's any reason I should be doing it, other than there is a need in our community for certain things to be done, and I try to help fulfill that need. One last thing, and I'm going to shut up, and thank you for letting me speak. If you guys ever need that the organizers of the Atheist Christian Book Club, if you guys ever want to cross post with me, I am the social media contact for the Metroplex Atheist page, and I also have the ability to post for the Fellowship of Free Thought Dallas, both in the on the meetup pages as well, but also in the groups online. So.
I really appreciate that. Really appreciate that.
We'd love to get together on a social thing, the members of the club, since we do, does that make sense, James? Since we,
Yeah, we used to, and one of the things I'm thankful for is that we've I really feared when we went Zoom, because we had this camaraderie of having to meal together for an hour and getting to know people and this friendship. But it's held up pretty well. I think new people that come in through Zoom, because we're all over the place now, not just in North Texas.
Right.
But they typically kind of see what we're doing and kind of emulate. So it's not a bash fest. It's not a flame war. It is a conversation, and people try to match that. I really appreciate that. Our survey. Our survey, to give you the numbers on that, I don't know if it reported on your end or not, but we had a majority of atheists this time. We had 72% atheist, 6% agnostic. We had only 17% Christian. Now the Christians are falling down on the job here, and we had one other in that category. So, but anyway, that was kind of surprising, and I'm glad to see that. And Julie, I'll give you some of the credit on that for co-hosting.
Thank you.
And,
thank you.
And I've said this before, but I know a lot of people are new, but one of the things that has come out of 5 years of doing this book club for me, and Bill and I have talked about this off club, and we've talked about this, is that we do have some things. I have more in common with some of my atheist friends at the club in some strange ways than some of my Christian friends at church. because the people at the club, whether you're atheist or agnostic or Christian, everybody agrees this is a critical issue, and this is something that needs to be talked about, and it needs to be talked about in a respectful manner, and this is important enough to read books, and we ought to read the other side and not just read the echo chamber material. So anyway, I agree with you on that, Julie. I really appreciate you being part of the club and helping through Freedom from Religion and also through Metroplex Atheist.
Not Freedom. I'm not a part of.
I'm sorry, not that one. Which was the other one?
I'm Metroplex Atheist and Fellowship of Free Thought Dallas.
I meant Fellowship of Free Thought. I meant that. I'm sorry. So
Julie, just a backstory, Julie. A couple of years ago, I was. I don't know if you know Zach Moore. I don't know if he's still.
Of course, I know Zach.
Yeah, Zach. So I haven't talked to Zach since pandemic, but Zach had me come out.
I'm going to see him on Saturday, actually.
Well, tell him I said hello, and I need to talk to him again. I haven't talked to him in a long time, but he brought me out. He brought me out. I've lost. I changed phones and lost his number, so I need to. But tell him that I said hi, and but he and I had a good working relationship for a while.
Yeah, he's a great guy. For those of you who don't know who Daniel is referring to, Zach Moore is one of the co-founding members of Fellowship of Free Thought Dallas, organization that was started. It's been 12 years now, going on. It'll be 13 years in February since Fellowship started. One last thing I did want to add about Metroplex. For those of you who'd like to meet me in person, I will actually be at Jay Gilligan's on November 16th, which is 2 weeks from yesterday, because next week I have my local Dallas Atheist Book Club meetup on next Wednesday. So I'll be at Jay Gilligan's 2 weeks from now if anybody wants to come meet me in person.
Cool.
Thanks so much, and appreciate all. Raise a hand, everybody that's this is your first time. Would you raise your hand? And let me see if I can get the whole screen on here. Anybody else? Okay. Well, welcome to the new people, and thank you for being part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Don't forget, next month, December 1st this time, first day of the month, on Thursday, we'll be meeting again and talk about Atheism on Trial, the book Atheism on Trial. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next month.